As a homeschooling family, we find that we are often looking for educational trips, different ways to enhance the learning experience. I've often believed that students learn much better when they are not stuck sitting in a classroom for 8 hours every day. They can get out and experience the world and learn about the world that they're going to be a major contributor of in the future. Therefore, through the years, we have gone to several museums and places like that. I often find it interesting to see old artifacts. Ones oftentimes will date back hundreds or even thousands of years. And people are often interested in the history of the things that they love too. What I mean by that, as an example, is that many of you, the regulars anyway, know that I love baseball. So just last year, Tracy and I took a trip to the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum up in Cooperstown, New York. When you're there, you can see a lot of baseball artifacts. Now, these don't date back thousands of years because baseball is just shy of 200 years old. But still, you can see the early balls, gloves, bats, programs, that kind of stuff. See how far the game has advanced through the years. In religion, the same thing applies. Many people are out there now searching for religious artifacts and relics, hoping to find something unique. Throughout the years, there have been stories of Christian artifacts that have been uncovered, and I'm honestly skeptical about the authority of such things, about the authenticity, because I realize that it can be hard in certain circumstances to conclusively prove that something is what we think it may be. What I mean by that is that every now and then in the news, every couple of years, the same story seems to pop up, and they'll say someone found Jesus' bones. Okay. Maybe this time they found it in a Pop-Tart box out in Montana somewhere, something like that, which is ludicrous, not because it's a Pop-Tart box in Montana, but it's ludicrous because it's the bones of Jesus. And we all know that the Bible clearly tells us that Jesus was bodily resurrected. So his bones are not here anymore. If anyone claims they're his bones, they are lying, or they are at least greatly misguided. Therefore, it makes me question the individuals who are making these, quote, discoveries too. Do they have a hidden agenda? Are they trying to cast doubt on Christianity? I think you can't help but ask those questions in that circumstance. Furthermore, some people believe that the shroud that Jesus' body was wrapped in, or part of that, is on display in a church in Italy to this day. Other people claim to have the actual pieces of the cross on which Jesus was crucified. The cross of Jesus, we know, is such a popular symbol. Can you imagine the interest that it would generate if someone proved beyond a doubt that they possessed a significant portion of the wood of the cross of Jesus? People would certainly flock from all over to catch a glimpse of this cross. Maybe people might even pay an admission fee to see it. I'm just keeping it real here. Kind of stuff happens. But sadly, I do feel that if that were the case, the interest of many people would lead into them worshiping the actual artifact because it's an earthly representation of the real thing. The fact is, people can make anything into an idol if they want to. For instance, you may not even know it, but I wear a cross necklace every day. I wear it inside my shirt rather than outside. Just the habit I've gotten into, so many people don't even know I have it on. I do that as a reminder of what Jesus did for me on the cross. I don't worship the little silver trinket. I don't pray to it. I don't think it has mystical divine powers. But by our human nature, we have a constant need to worship something, or these things that we can see and touch. because in our minds they make good substitutes for God. It is that cross that I want to focus on this morning, and we will actually finish up our series that we have been looking at the middle part of the Gospel of John. We'll be looking at Mark chapter 8, reading verses 34 through 38, to see what Jesus himself said about the cross and its role in our lives. So, the words of the passage are on the screen as always in the New King James Version this morning, which is the same translation as your Pew Bible if you'd like to turn to it as well. And the word of the Lord says, beginning in Mark chapter 8, verse 34, "When he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, 'Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed of when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels.'" May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. This morning we're going to look at 3 points. I'll put them up on the screen all at once. That way I'm not flipping back and forth between them. But the first is we will look at what the cross meant to a typical Jew at the time of Jesus when he was speaking. Then we'll look at what the cross did not mean. There's a big distinction between the two. And thirdly, we'll look at the nature of salvation as seen through the cross. So when we read the Bible, the best way typically to interpret the Scriptures is to do our best to look at it through the eyes of the initial reader. And the farther we get from those individuals, the more difficult it often becomes for us. When we look at scenes like this where Jesus is talking to a crowd, we should try to the best of our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of those individuals who were receiving the original teaching from Jesus. So in this passage, we need to put it in the context of what came before. We need to remember that this scene immediately follows the scene where Peter takes Jesus aside and rebukes him in private for suggesting that he would have to be killed. The scene's sort of like this. There's a large group in the area, and they're hanging out with the disciples, and Peter pulls him aside so no one else can hear. At least he's being respectful in that way, and he rebukes Jesus, and that's when Jesus turns away from Peter towards the crowd and addresses, or speaking in their direction most likely, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." That leads into Jesus' words to the crowd that we read today. And he starts telling them what's going to happen if they do want to become his disciples. They will have to take up a cross. Now, you probably know that a disciple is one who is a serious student of a particular teacher. So in other words, if you want to have that close relationship with Jesus Christ and learn from him, Jesus is telling them they have to die, or be willing to die anyway. Now, I see a lot of commercials on TV, billboards on my way home in the evening of colleges that seems like everyone is now offering an online education. And in these advertisements, they tell you how easy it is to get your degree from the comfort of your own home. I sound like a voiceover man just saying that. They'll tell you how cheap it is and also how prestigious this is too. So this is a good investment for you. Of all of these advertisements I've seen and heard, I have yet to hear one that uses the talking point, enroll with us today, but be willing to die first. Okay? Of course, they don't say that kind of thing, and it sounds funny to put it in those terms, but that's exactly what Jesus was teaching here in Mark chapter 8. You see, everyone at the time knew what the cross meant, They knew it was meant to humiliate and to kill. That's why many archaeologists believe that there's really not a reasonable expectation that Christ's actual cross would be found. They don't think it would have been preserved by the members of the early church. They knew what it was meant for. It carried out that mission, and they wouldn't have wanted to have this remembrance of this humiliation of their dear friend and teacher. They would have wanted to forget all that, if anything. That's what we need to realize, though, the seriousness of the cross. The cross wasn't a mere ceremony. And I say that because to many Christians, even this day, their religion is largely ceremony with a few extra things sprinkled in. When Jesus told the crowd to take up their cross and follow him, he wasn't talking about putting on a fancy piece of jewelry. He meant they would have to undergo a serious, life-transforming event. And there's nothing more life-transforming than going to the cross, because it's going to end your life. No question about what that means. The purpose is to kill, period. And humiliate too, like I said, but ultimately to kill. Whereas we read in the Bible other instances where Jesus is teaching and he was often misunderstood, this is a teaching that was not misunderstood at all. Everyone knew what he meant when he was teaching this. In a nutshell, that's what the cross is all about, being humiliated to the point of death. It's a concept that is foreign to Americans here in the 21st century because we live under the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Let's just say that the Romans of the time of Jesus didn't have such a law. For them, the crueler the better in terms of punishment, and they would rule with an iron fist, as they often felt they had to do. Having said that, we do need to set the parameters of the cross by now understanding what the cross does not mean. Above all, the cross is not about promoting oneself or one's agenda. Since the cross is a method of execution, that is a sentence that must be carried out. To put it in modern day terms, no one asked to go to the electric chair. If you ever get caught up in the beauty of a cross, that you see these ornately crafted ones that look very pretty at the Christian bookstore, just imagine in your mind a small electric chair instead. It's really what it was in modern day terms. Would you wear a trinket of an electric chair around your neck on a necklace? Or would you display an electric chair on your wall at home? Probably not, unless that electric chair meant something very important to you. And the way I look at it, when we encounter a cross as a decoration or a piece of jewelry, it should be a somber and solemn decoration that might even inspire in you a sense of sorrow, because we know that's what the cross was meant to bring. Nothing more than sorrow. Let's go back to the Bible now. Bible's always a good place to go to. When I think of Jesus' teaching, I often think of these paintings that I've seen through the years. Brilliant artists will paint Jesus outside, and he's sitting on maybe a large rock, and there's people sitting around him, maybe some children playing, and everyone is intently looking at Jesus. And if you notice the faces of many of the people, they're almost always smiling whenever Jesus is teaching, because that's the kind of guy Jesus was. He just made you smile. Well, the Bible does not tell us in Mark chapter 8 what the crowd's reaction was when Jesus was giving them this teaching. But I think we can figure from the context that we just explored, there were probably not many, if any, smiles on the faces of those people when he's talking about going to the cross. The same goes for Peter. Okay, imagine what Peter must be thinking as of this moment. Just a minute ago, he's visibly upset with Jesus for suggesting that he would have to be killed. But what does Jesus do now? Jesus one-ups him, as we say. Jesus is basically thinking, okay, you thought it was bad when I said I was going to have to go get executed? Well, guess what? If you want to follow me, you're going to have to do it too. How do you think that went over? That's why I don't think there were many smiles on the faces of the people who were listening to Jesus that day. Do you realize, though, that when Jesus was talking to the crowd that day and talking to his disciples, his audience wasn't limited to those in Caesarea Philippi that day. He was talking to us, too. Are you willing to follow Jesus, even if it means losing your life in the process? Why do you think Mark doesn't record a response to the crowd in his writings? I think part of the reason, and there could be more than one reason, but I think part of it is that Mark knows the reader has to make up his or her mind for him or herself. Therefore, Mark doesn't want a person to be swayed by the actions or opinions of another person in regards to following Jesus. All too often I see Christians say things and post things online along the lines of, Jesus will do this for you if you come to him, and everything will be just fine. And it's very misleading, if not completely false. And I often wonder if the people who say those things and post those things really wonder if they truly know what they're saying. I cannot think of a single guaranteed earthly benefit that Jesus promises, by coming to him. As the passage illustrates, all the guarantees Jesus gives us are negative ones. So it makes you wonder then, why in the world would anyone sign up for that? If we said, okay, everybody, if you want to die, line up over here at the door, you could hear a pin drop in the room. I don't know anyone who would line up for that. But there are actually people who do sign up for something like that. And the reason is because they can see past this life into eternity. The true Christian believer realizes that this life is just a vapor. It is here one day and gone the next. But that person is able to compare that in their mind to eternity that goes on and on and on. So you need to ask yourself the question, is eternity with God worth these hardships that we endure here on earth, even to the point of death? Are you willing to take up your cross and follow Jesus? Sadly, the majority of individuals in the world at any given moment answer no to that question. So they don't come to Jesus and they don't follow him. They leave their cross laying on the ground. For all of us, that's really what it boils down to. Can you see the future benefit of a life spent serving God for eternity over doing your own thing and your own desires now? With no regard at all for God. We make that choice every single day. I got to tell you another thing that really bothers me. This is like the fingernails down the chalkboard. When people say, my religion is a private, personal matter. And you know what? When they say that, I want to say, yeah, you're actually right. Your religion is a private, personal matter. But Jesus's wasn't so private and wasn't so personal. Really shouldn't be that way. Taking up the cross was a public spectacle. Everyone in the area saw it. So, is Jesus saying we can go around and be a closet Christian? No, he's not saying anything at all like that. It reminds me of a story, and I may have said this somewhere along the way, but it applies here again. Man went to church on Christmas Day. It was one of the 2 days that year that he decided to darken the doorway of a house of worship, the other being Easter, naturally. He figured that's the least he could do for God, you know. So on his way out, the pastor greets everyone, and the pastor wishes them a Merry Christmas. He realizes he hadn't seen him for several months, pastor says, "Son, you need to join the Lord's army." And the man responds, he says, "I already have. I'm in the Secret Service." Satan wins the battle when he convinces a person that there is such a thing as a closet Christian or a Secret Service believer. They are what we call oxymorons. And I'm not calling anyone a name here. An oxymoron is something that's contradictory in terms. It makes no sense. Sort of like saying dry water. You know, what is that? It doesn't make any sense. But people hear the teaching of Jesus about the cross and taking up their cross, and they wonder why anyone would ever want to publicly humiliate themselves by associating with Jesus and associating with the cross and risk losing their own life. What is more precious to a person than their own life? But they don't realize that by following Jesus and taking up the cross, it's like being a seed. What I mean by that is that when a farmer goes out into the field and plants his seed, do we say, "Oh no, the farmer lost all of his seed"? No, he didn't lose it. He put the seed to its best use by planting it into the ground, putting it to its natural use, which is what it's meant to do. It'll go into the ground and lose its seed properties, but then it grows into a plant, a life-giving plant at that. That's what it's like when we're willing to give up our lives by taking up the cross. You're not losing your life, you're gaining eternity with the Father and becoming what He ultimately intends you to be. For Jesus, the cross was the ultimate test of faith. Scholars say that there were some 350 or so individual prophecies in the Bible that were fulfilled by Jesus. But I ask you, what if Jesus didn't go to the cross and He fulfilled all the others but that one? Would God the Father say, "Well, he was pretty close, he got most of them"? No. The Messiah had to fulfill every single one of them. And in a way, the cross was a major way, the final way, that God used to weed out any pretender Messiah, at least from a human perspective. And you know what? God gives us that same test, the cross. If we are not willing to bear it daily, then God has weeded you out as a pretender Christian believer, a pretender disciple. You can look like a Christian by going to church every Sunday and tithing your 10% and giving your extra offerings and praying and reading your Bible every day and teaching Sunday school and serving on church council and doing all those things. But if you don't carry your cross, then that's a sign that you aren't all in with Jesus. And for God, close isn't good enough. Jesus breaks it down for us. It's about our souls. Our souls are what will survive past this world. And we know there are only two alternatives once you take your last breath, heaven and hell. Jesus' words even imply that the chances are very narrow that any person at random is going to be willing to take up a cross, because He says, "If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation." If you're an adulterous and sinful generation, then you participate in the leaven of the Pharisees. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Jesus talked about that just a few verses earlier in the same chapter. That leaven encompasses many things, but at its core, it is rooted in sinfulness and selfishness. So I just want to close this morning by saying that people who selfishly love their own sin and they don't understand the appeal of the cross, because it means you deny yourself, as Jesus says in verse 34, those people are what Mark is talking about in the middle section of his gospel. It's all about selfishness from chapters 6, 7, and 8, and even into 9. But there's also good news, isn't there? What does the word gospel mean? It means good news, and this is a gospel for us. The gospel truth is that we can overcome our feelings of selfishness, these feelings that we are inclined to. We can do so with the help of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit can give us the strength we need to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus. We don't do it happily. We don't go skipping and dancing to the cross, but we do it joyfully. There's a difference between happy and joyful. I'm sure we know that difference. Just ask Jesus for the strength to do so, and He will give it to you. He is faithful to do so. There is joy in knowing that you have proven to the world and to God your Father that you are not ashamed of Jesus Christ, and you know that you have an eternal reward awaiting you when the trials of this world are over. Let us now bow our heads and go to the Lord in prayer.